Hello, hello, hello. There's not too many things that annoy me more than to be in the middle of a canning project and later find out that my efforts have been in vain because the jars don't seal. It's a little bit frustrating. It's a lot frustrating. It can be a lot frustrating. Canning can be simple if you're doing something like cherries or grapes that we talked about in another video, or it can take a little more time like beef stew or chili or let's see, beef stew, chili, soups, that kind of thing. You have quite a lot of time invested, especially if you're peeling vegetables or peeling pears or what have you. So you really want your jars to seal if that's at all possible. There's a couple things that prevent it. You always want to take your canning jar and visually inspect the top of the rim. In addition to visually inspecting it, I always take my index, oops, backwards, take my index finger and just run it around the top edge of the lid to see if I can feel any imperfection in the lid, in the rim, excuse me, in the rim. Just run your finger all the way around it and see if you feel any imperfection. If there's a little gouge at the top of this, chances are it may not seal. Sometimes there's a little bigger gouge in it. Then recycle the jar, just get rid of it, because unless you're going to put, you could put rice in it or you could put beans in it, but you're probably not going to get a seal to use it for a dry pack either. More than likely it's not going to work for dry pack. So if you just want to use it for salt in your cupboard or what have you, then that's fine. But make sure you know that that jar is not to be used for canning, because you're just going to waste your energy. So inspect the top of the jar, make sure that there's no gouges or little, what do you call that? I can't think of words lately. Anyways, a little gouge in the top of the jar, then you need to get rid of it. The second thing is, it's going to be more than two things. Just warn you now. You have two pieces, of course, in your canning lid. The ring over here. The camera is backwards, so it's so strange because I move this hand and the other hand moves. And you have a red, the lids that I use have a red sealing compound, orange red sealing compound. And you want to make sure that this is completely clean and free from debris. I'm backwards again. Free from debris when you put it on the top of your jar. So as a matter of habit, even if the lids are brand new, and I'll talk about sterilizing in a different video. It's a long story. I always take the lid, the last thing, and I have the sink water running, and I put it under the sink water one more time, make sure that it's clean. Nothing is, you can have quite a mess in the kitchen if you're doing tomatoes or something, and you don't want a tomato seed or a little bit of pulp underneath there. And then that's the very last thing, and then I run my finger around the top of the jar, and then wipe it with a cloth, make sure it's completely clean, and then screw the lid down. Now, another thing that you want to pay attention to is how far you screw this lid down, this ring band, because it needs to be, I don't want to get into the science of it because I might get something wrong and then somebody will be upset with me. It needs to be tight enough that the sealing compound is snugly against the top of the jar, the glass on the top of the jar. But it also needs to be loose enough that when the contents get really hot in this jar, it pushes the air out from underneath the lid, because that's what's going to cause your vacuum seal when the time comes, when the jar begins to cool and it contracts as it cools. If I'm wrong, somebody correct me. It expands as it heats and pushes the air out from underneath the lid, some of the air. And then as it cools, it contracts enough to suck that middle of your lid down. Can you hear that? I'm sure you can hear that. And it will go down and stay down. And then you want to leave that ring band intact for at least, I'm going to say at least 24 hours, a little bit longer if you're pressure canning something for like 90 minutes. I would keep it a little longer, like 36 hours till everything is completely cool. It takes a long time for those suckers to cool down before you remove the ring band, because you want the sealing compound to solidify enough to hold the seal. Making this way too complicated. So anyways, so when you screw this down, you want to screw it until it's barely a little resistance and then a little further. But don't wrench it down as tight as you can, because then you're making it more difficult for the process to take place. So it's called snugly tight. You start to feel some resistance and then turn it a little bit harder, but don't wrench it. No, don't, especially if your husbands are helping you, or your boyfriends, or your sons, or your nephews, or your grandsons. Make sure they don't wrench it down as tight as they can. You don't want that to happen. Okay, so having said that, I've got you thoroughly confused now and making it sound like rocket science when it's not. But you really, once you get that much energy and effort put into a jar, you really want it to seal and keep. Having said that, I'm going to make this video way too long. The other thing you don't want to have happen is when you're done with the canning process is to yank that jar out of a screaming hot canner and set it down and have that extreme change in temperature. I don't understand even the simplest things about the science of it, but what ends up happening if when you do that, you yank it out of a screeching hot boiling pot of water, or worse yet, a pressure canner, when the pressure drops down to zero. When the pressure drops down to zero, these jars are still boiling inside. You can set them down and watch them boil on the countertop. They're still boiling, blah, 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 blah. On top of the countertop. You don't want that. I'm going to tell you why. Because what happens is the temperature shock, for reasons I don't totally comprehend, causes these jars to begin to spurt. And they will spurt not just air, but they will spurt part of the contents of the jar underneath that sealing compound. Let me unscrew this here. And then it disrupts. You'll see the red sealing compound. There, you can see it better now. It interferes with the ability of it to be tight up against the glass and seal. You want it to seal. I'm making this way too hard. This video is going to be way too long. So what you really want to do, I don't care what your books say, what you really, really want to do, let's say this is full of cherries because they're so easy to can. What you really, really want to do is, whether you're using a steam canner, which I love, you can read about that in the Savvy Equipment, I think it's the Savvy Equipment video, you could watch that. Let's say it's full of cherries and I have just processed it for, I don't know how long it is, 30 minutes in a boiling pot of water. It doesn't need to be pressure canned. Then what you're going to do, listen to the lady, what you're going to do is turn the heat off at the end of that period of time and leave the lid on the canner for a few minutes. Let the temperature begin to come down a little bit. Leave it on for a few minutes. Leave the lid on for a few minutes. Then after 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and it's all done boiling and the heat is off, then take the lid off the canner. Your boiling hot water bath canner or your steam canner. The steam canner, you actually can let that sit a little bit longer and let the temperature begin. Steam canner is not quite so extreme. Back to the topic. You're going to let that sit with the lid off. The water is probably at least this far over the top of your canning jars, ideally, if you're using a boiling hot water bath. I'm going to call it a boiling hot water bath because I don't want people to think it's just a hot water bath. It's a boiling hot water bath. You don't begin to count the time until the water begins to boil. There's a lot of controversy involved with that, but I won't go there right now because the steam canner doesn't exactly do that. So there's a little controversy there. Can't think of the word. So anyway, we're going to turn the heat down. You're going to turn the heat off. Let it sit a few minutes. Take the lid off of the canning pot. Let it sit a few minutes, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, 6, 7, 8 minutes. Then take your jar lifter and pretend this is a jar lifter. I got to find mine. I don't know what I did with it. And hook it on and bring it up out of the hot water bath and set it down on a folded towel. And then if it starts to spurt liquid, you start to see it spurting liquid, you probably won't. If you've done that, it probably won't spurt liquid. If it does, you either put that jar back where you got it from in the canner for a few more minutes, or let that one sit on this folded towel and wait another 5 or 10 minutes before you yank the rest of the cherries out. Sometimes if the jars spurt, they will still seal, but you're cutting your chances down of that happening. If you have to process it another time, then it's sat another 30 minutes or so in boiling hot water, and you begin to lose some of the quality and texture of your cherries, or your, what, doesn't matter with grapes because you're not worried about the texture of grapes, you're just doing those for juice. But peaches and pears and cherries and so forth, it would make a difference. Applesauce is not going to make any difference. I'm making this way too long. How long is it? Ooh, we're over 10 minutes. Okay. Those are the reasons that your jar won't seal 9 times out of 10. You might get a batch of canning lids that are either old or just something wasn't quite right with them. In that case, probably all your jars will not seal. I had that happen one time. It was not pleasant. Let's see the list. A chip on the rim, old lids. Okay, that's about the end of that. Now my screensaver's gone on me, so I can't see myself anymore. It'll come back in a second. So that is the end of the video. There I am. Okay, that's the end of the video. Those are the reasons that your jar won't seal 9 times out of 10. If somebody thinks of other things that I forgot, just put a little comment down below and let's help each other out so that we get 100% success rates. I have learned over years and years and years of doing this that a little extra care in the, sorry, my glasses are crooked, a little extra care in the beginning gives you a better result in the end. And there's no need to go through all that work and then have 3 jars out of 7 not seal, or 3 jars out of 8, or 4 jars out of 8, or what have you. That's, oh, I'm not going to say what have you anymore. I'm going to work really hard at not saying that. It's annoying. That's the end of the video. I didn't mean to go 10 minutes, but those are the reasons your jars might not seal. So do a little prevention. Just remember, if you yank it out of a screeching hot pot and bring it out into the 71-degree air, whatever it is, it's going to spurt more than likely. If you have better results and that's not a problem, that's fine. But I have found that it's better to give it a few minutes to settle down. And we'll talk about, I'm sorry. Let me talk about the pressure canner for a second. If you don't want to hear this, just cut me off. It's fine. With a pressure canner, those suckers are extremely hot, like hotter than boiling. And so with a pressure canner, it's even more important to let it cool down at a little more gradual pace. So with a pressure canner, I just will tell you, I always make sure that my food is not really cooked when I put it in the jar. If I'm going to make beef stew or bean soup or chili, I mix up all the ingredients with the exception of if it's got tomato paste or tomato sauce in it. I am told that you need to make sure your beans are cooked first because they may not soften in a mixture that has tomato paste, tomato juice in it. So let's say this is going to be bean soup. So I would go through all the process, same process. You put the stuff in there. I got one more thing to say. I'll go into this, and I'll try to go into this in another video. We will talk later about why it's generally going to cause you problems. The headspace, I know they have it for a reason, but generally speaking, if you fill your jar, my personal opinion, don't bank on it, but my personal opinion is if you fill the jar higher than right here, the bottom of the neck, I guess you would say, you can see right. If you fill it higher than this rim right here, the bottom of the ring band, chances are when it expands, you're going to run a greater risk of having debris underneath your sealing compound. Having said that, you do what the books say, or you do what you want to do, not what I told you to do. However, let's go back to the pressure canning. The contents of this jar is going to be wildly boiling when the time is up. Okay, you have to wait till the pressure comes down to 0 before you can even take the lid off of your pressure canner. It has been my experience, stick my neck out here, it's been my experience that you're better off to let it alone for a while. Once the pressure's down to 0, mine has a little pressure regulator that can be lifted off the top. I guess I'm trying to think if they all do. I have to think about that a while. The pressure regulator is like a weight, and you can't take that off. You're not supposed to take that off until it reaches 0. So once it reaches 0, I wait 3 or 4 minutes, 5, 6 minutes. Then I take the pressure regulator off. Now the canning lid is still shut, still sealed. I wait a few more minutes, and then I loosen the canning lid after a few more minutes because the contents in these jars are wildly boiling still, even though you got the heat off. So the heat's off. So then I loosen the lid and I let it set a couple minutes. Then I open the lid yay far and twist it a little so that there's room for the air to go back and forth, in and out of there. And I let that sit for 3 or 4 minutes. And then 3 or 4 minutes later, I take the lid off the top and I let it